elsewhere.
And I've seen the promised land.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. And stop and I turn and I go for a ride. And I get to the bottom and I see you again.
It's a direct confrontation between them and protesters determined to stay put.
I'm a socialist, I'm a revolutionary, I want to change the society.
Another night of violence. The burnt-out barricades are still in position. The tear gas still hangs in the air.
We have tried in Czechoslovakia to build up a really dignified, democratic, socialist system.
Viet Cong have already died, and a lot more are dying in there right now.
I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives.
There was new violence today in Northern Ireland after weekend riots left more than 80 persons injured.
The whole Civil Rights Association is a front movement for the destruction of the Constitution of Northern Ireland.
October the 5th, a day that will be remembered in this city for some years.
For me, it was a trail of blood. Nothing like your North, but I mean, from the very beginning, there was blood. Blood on our foreheads, on our scalps, people dead on the pavement, the never-ending blood of Vietnam, the blood of friends, the blood of leaders, blood, blood, blood. Hell no, we won't go! 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 Hell no, we won't go!
If I see that light once more, you're under arrest. It's blinding me.
They knocked me down. They disgraced me. They misrepresented me.
Was this the police or was
this is the Chicago police? The blue and white, that's right.
Being part of a new generation, a student generation, for example, was crucial to our identity. You come to a point where you ask, is this all there is to life? Will I settle for what my parents have provided me? If I should settle for an establishment that was telling me to crawl under a desk if there was an atomic bomb that went off, or if I could afford it, my family should dig a bomb shelter in the backyard. Should I settle for that kind of future? Or was there something of an alternative?
We could think, without being ridiculous, that the things were moving in the direction of more democracy, more freedom, more, for some of us, revolution.
We grew to appreciate oppression comes in many forms and many complexions. It may be about religion, it may be about race, or gender, or class, but whatever it is, there's an uneven playing field. And the rules are not public, and the goals are not clear. And some people consistently get the short end of the stick. So we began to identify with people struggling for freedom and equality all around the world.
I would describe Derry in the early 60s with 3 words: defeat, despair, and the dole.
Spread your wings.
It would be untrue to say that the Catholic working class were the only ones to suffer, but it's absolutely true to say that they suffered the most. No question about that.
When it comes to electing the local council of Londonderry, the council that runs the affairs of the city, we have a rather odd situation. The total unionist vote in Londonderry is 9,000. And these votes put a total of 12 members in the city council. The total nationalist vote is 14,000. And these votes put in 8 members. Now, I would stress that these figures have been rounded off, but are substantially accurate. Now, note the curious situation. Most of the voters in Londonderry are nationalist, but the council is controlled by the unionists.
Looking at it, you would say, yeah, it was gerrymandering. I can't think that it possibly was that. I mean, at that time, there was business votes. Anybody who had a business had votes. It was a ratepayers franchise at local government, and it was the old basis of he who pays the piper calls the tune.
It was a protectionist policy adopted by unionist politicians not to allow Catholic houses. And to their everlasting shame, and shame on them, it was a policy of theirs. You know, it was vile, it was vindictive, it was disgusting. That's only because the people who were implementing it were vile and disgusting individuals. They had to be. Common decency would have demanded that you wouldn't have done things like that.
Why do you think you've not been lucky on the housing list so far?
Because we're Catholics.
But something deep in my heart tells me I'm right, that I don't think so.
I can recall a chap called Timoney. He'd gone off to university, come back to Derry with a degree, had applied for a job in Derry Guildhall, a rather lowly clerk, and didn't get the job, even though he was clearly, with third-level education, he was much the most qualified person. And I recall that the excuse given by the local corporation was that this chap was too well qualified for the job. Oh, we thought, that everybody on the Bogside knew that. Everybody had heard that. That Eugene Timoney had been turned down for a job in the corporation because he had too many qualifications. And we thought, and rightly so. What will they think of next? There is nothing these people won't do to exclude Catholics.
Are they not giving you jobs then because you're a Catholic?
Well, I can't say, for I haven't got the proof.
Well, they don't give the boys the jobs because they're Catholics. You'll not get very many Protestants in this town idle. It's all the Catholic boys who's idle, not the Protestant boys.
Now for something much more pleasant.
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
I was just amazed later on, all of us were, that we, in our rather innocent protests in Alabama, and South Carolina, and Georgia, that because of TV and mass media, it was being seen in Ireland, in Poland, in South Africa. So students around the world began to get the inspiration from our marches and our risk and our going to jail.
The impact of what was happening in the rest of the world, as opposed to what was happening politically in Northern Ireland, had more impact on me. Television in many working class houses had really only taken hold in the early 60s. But by 67, 68, they were fairly commonplace. And people were seeing things on the news. And the news brought the world to your doorstep.
It was a very simple lesson being pushed throughout the 60s by radical groups, and that was provocation works. A small group of people on the margins of society, if they can provoke violence from the authorities, if they can have that caught on camera, then they can inspire more people to get involved.
I was very interested in the American civil rights movement, and I was later involved in setting up a Young Socialist Alliance in Belfast. We were then in touch with a group with the same name in the United States, the Young Socialist Alliance there, which was very involved in the black civil rights struggle, so we got a lot of literature from them. So we were able to follow the debates inside the civil rights movement in America.
I remember holding a Vietnam Solidarity flag at a student meeting because you were absolutely insistent, this is not local. This is not just about this. This is about all of these liberation movements.
It was a time of change. People wanted change, and they were not. The apathy was now dissipating. You know, it was evaporating, and people began to see that all these struggles are interrelated in some way. We were not just part of a kind of a local, parochial protest movement. We were part of something which is much bigger.
The time I spent in London in the 1960s was certainly significant for me, and looking back on it, significant to this day, because it helped shape the politics, most of which I hope I have retained over the years, and it certainly shaped my perception of what was going on in Northern Ireland, and it gave me a sense sort of that in Northern Ireland too, we had to try to fit the local issues, the Northern Ireland issues, into an international perspective. Sort of gave me a conviction that this was the way forward, that the sense of futility which attended nationalist politics back home could be overcome, that we could possibly sweep over the local, provincial politics of Northern Ireland by introducing sort of the international dimension to it. I still believe that.
Clearly, in the first instance, for us, one of our heroes was Martin Luther King. And his challenge to those of us who watch television was to take part in a movement and to use the tools of civil disobedience.
His view of white and black rose above that of governors and senators and presidents. He had a world transforming view.
Folks, move out of 7th Street, please, and keep the streets open.
I'm not into the cult of heroes, but I have to confess to you that the leader of the black civil rights movement at that time would have been a hero of mine. Thought he was a wonderful individual. That speech that he made, "I Have a Dream," really set me on fire, that the absolute sincerity and the clarity of vision of the man.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The thing that Martin Luther King had above everyone, he had the capacity to make the hair stand on the back of my head because he was such a wonderful orator.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
By 1968, before his assassination, Martin Luther King was in favor of radical restructuring of society and the economy in America. Really, he was going for helping the poor people, black, white in America. It was the poor people's campaign he was behind. That's what the civil rights movement had become. And he was also against the Vietnam War. So this kind of more radical Martin Luther King is much more in fitting with what Michael Farrell and what Eamon McCann wanted.
There's a freedom explosion all over the world, and I think of our movement here in the United States as a part of that worldwide struggle to achieve justice and freedom and human dignity.
I know the term is often used, non-violence, but everywhere where Martin Luther went, violence reacted against his marchers and his speeches. So I'm not comfortable with the term non-violence, and I don't think it certainly didn't apply when we tried those methodologies in Northern Ireland. It was far from non-violent.
Jesus, Gandhi, Dr. King, Northern Ireland, this movement for change was sweeping the world. And those who resisted it, often leaders of the status quo, some governor, some state official, they were always wiped out because they were battling the future. And the past cannot stop the future any more than dark can stop light.
The people in Northern Ireland have all the civil rights they need. They have freedom of speech, freedom of everything. They need no civil rights.
There were really two people behind many of the organisations, the Derry Housing Action, this, that and the other. It was phone the papers and put in a statement and say you're from whatever and create this belief that there was this agitation, but really it was two people very Marxist, socialist minded, especially Eamon McCann.
I returned quite accidentally to Derry. I was intending to stay for about 10 days, but while I was back in Derry, I met an old friend, Jeremy McLenaghan, who said, we're carrying out this action, we're going to block the Lecky Road in the Bogside with a caravan at the weekend. Will you come and help us? So I did become involved in that.
When Eamon came to Derry and joined the Labour Party, he immediately caused division. Not with intent or not with malice, but just because of what he was politically. And that is a compliment to him, by the way.
The only people really stirring things up in Northern Ireland are the Unionist government. You see, if the issues did not exist, it would be impossible to agitate upon them. I make no bones about it. I don't want just to embarrass unionism. I want to destroy it.
There was an energy. He's a brilliant orator and had a lot of positive ideas. And like we began opposing evictions and things like that.
We squatted people. People used to say at the time, well, you know, squatting's unfair because it means there's queue jumping. But there couldn't be queue jumping if there was no official queue.
One of the main protests occurred when the mayor wanted to officially open the underdeck of Craigavon Bridge. So the Housing Action Committee decided that they were going to disrupt the ceremony, and they made placards, you know, talking about bad conditions in housing, etc. And they got along each side of the bridge, and as his car, he had to cut a ribbon, of course, and as his car was coming across, we ran out, sat down on the bridge with the placards up. And of course then, I mean, the point is we were dragged off the bridge.
I say to Democrats in Northern Ireland and Britain, are we going to be like the Jews? Are we going to sit down and watch all this happening? Or are we going to stand up and say, look here, Adolf Craig, we're not taking no nonsense?
Having Finbar as a twin, not only as a twin but as a brother, was quite an experience because he was very daring. He got involved in all people's problems. People would come to him asking for help. He would stick his neck out, and if he got involved in anything, he got stuck into it 100%. And he was absolutely fearless.
The people of Londonderry have suffered gerrymandering, a lack of jobs, 5,800 people unemployed, no homes, people living in hovels. No one has bothered to do anything about it. In 12 months, 8 houses were built by Londonderry Corporation. The people are retaliating now.
The authorities could not cope with us, and so they stuck labels on us, and the label they stuck on us was Republicans and Communists.
Troublemakers. That's been called to me a million times. We were trouble, and we were. And I set out to cause trouble. I mean, I've no apology to make. But I was trying to create trouble for the people who were denying us access to housing, to jobs, to adult universal suffrage.
The emergence of a self-conscious student class is reminiscent of the emergence of a self-conscious working class in the 19th century. That was a comment in the Times just over a year ago. At the time, it might have sounded wildly far-fetched. But does it now?
What is order? What is disorder? I would say there was disorder before. It's why there is no action.
When the students came down in the street, they have shown to the people that it was really possible to have an actual fight against a certain type of regime.
There was an appetite, there was something strong for more freedom, more liberty, for a more liberal society. General de Gaulle was a great man, but he had forgotten the social problems and the society problems. And social problems and society problems exploded at his face in '68.
I'm a socialist, I'm a revolutionary, I want to change the society.
One of the things that Danny Cohn-Bendit said about '68 is that street fighting leads to political struggle. And this was something which was really felt by the Northern Irish radicals, the Northern Irish 68ers. They acted very similarly to the famous 19th century French revolutionary Auguste Blanqui, who argued, why are we discussing what's on the other side of the river? Let's cross over and see.
Student activism in Paris, in the May riots in Paris, were hugely iconic for us. They told us as a generation that we had solidarity with the French students and that we realized that the numbers involved were really quite small, and yet they were pivotal in the changes that nearly brought about the downfall of the Gaullist government at the time.
A lot of what was happening in France was violent, and there was a kind of so we couldn't totally embrace what was happening in France, but what was happening showed what could be achieved.
You've got to remember that the times that were in it, as they say, that the demo in Paris and all the rest of it, Danny Cohn-Bendit, all of these people, the civil rights marches in America. Queen's previously having been politically, I think, a pretty passive place. And then you have this, upsurging of sort of spontaneous, sort of youthful protests. And that was a new phenomenon. And actually a very fateful one for O'Neill and the government of Northern Ireland.
It's unfortunate that Stormont did not realise that there was a wind of change, and it was blowing through America. It wasn't just blowing through Africa, it was also blowing through Europe, and it was blowing here.
We had come to the point where there were no houses being built in the Dungannon District Council area because it affected the voting pattern. And the overcrowding in the Catholic wards had therefore become absolutely untenable.
Houses were allocated in the village of Callerton. They were allocated, despite the fact that there were some people on the housing list who were in very, very bad conditions. They were not allocated on the basis of need. There were two families squatted, whom I supported, the Goodfellas and the McKennas. What brought things to a head was the fact that the house from which the McKennas were evicted, which was next door to the Goodfellas, that house was allocated to a 19-year-old girl who wasn't married. That was the scandal. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, as far as I was concerned.
I have seen injustice. It has not been remedied. I will continue to fight until it is remedied. And if Captain O'Neill's speeches about community relations mean anything, then situations like this ought to be remedied, and I shouldn't have to take the type of action which I have taken today.
I relied on the television. And that night after the squatting, I had the satisfaction of watching an interview on BBC National, me being interviewed about something that had never been exposed outside Northern Ireland. So that was a very successful exercise.
They would have been blind and deaf not to be aware that pressure was growing on these issues, both internally within Northern Ireland and externally from the government in London. The question is, what could one do about it? It was all very well for O'Neill and, for instance, his finance minister, Kirk, to keep reminding people how very heavily dependent we were in London, that at the end of the day, we would have to do what London wanted us to do. But on the other hand, an awful lot of unreconstructed people who continued to see any concession to this as putting them on a slippery slope that was going to take them inexorably in a direction they didn't want to go.
I travelled to Mahara to a meeting of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association executive, and we put a proposal to them that there be a civil rights march between Coal Island and Dungannon, that we in the Dungannon area would organise the march, would provide the stewards. What we wanted from them was their banner and their umbrella.
We had been holding regular protests outside the City Hall for some months about the Vietnam War, but we now held a protest about the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And when we finished that, the Coal Island Dungannon March was in the early evening, so we drove down to the Dungannon, having quickly reversed our placards and put slogans relevant to that march on top of the rush out of Czechoslovakia slogans.
We actually made a banner for it, and we arrived and we were told, no banners and we don't want you here. And so clearly the Dungannon Civil Rights Association had no desire to have the young socialists around them.
My first real political lesson was the realisation when the march stopped that it had stopped because we were not allowed to go any further. And I couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that the police were standing across the road saying we were not allowed to go into Dungannon Square.
500,000 troops invading Prague and the potential for World War III, at least in some people's eyes. This is headline news everywhere, and a relatively peaceful march in Dungannon doesn't feature anywhere. And Terence O'Neill is sitting in England on a Sunday morning, going through the Sunday Times page by page, and is delighted to find there's no mention of it. So there's no violent incidents, there's no story, there's no sympathy, there's no action taken by either Stormont or by the British government.
I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land.
What struck me that night was that it was so authentic. I saw men crying. It was an unusual response to what was a great but typical sermon. There was something about the pathos and the passion of that moment that took us to another level.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory.
At least in an emotional sense, there was no one to replace them. We were very much on our own and started to feel, I guess, in the worst sense, that we were not has-beens. I don't know if you know that American phrase. We were might-have-beens. That we would always be doomed to wonder what might have been.
Devastated, utterly devastated. There was a man of such inspirational qualities. It's hard to imagine that his life would be snuffed out in the manner it was, and we're not just sure who was responsible for it even at this moment in time.
The Martin Luther King assassination led to explosions across America. There'd be ghetto riots across America. And this had a big impact in Europe. It was kind of the radicalization that was happening. And there was this sort of burn, baby, burn attitude. It was very inspiring to some students who felt, yeah, we should be doing this. We should be becoming more radical.
To the young kids, it makes no difference to them if it's a Democrat or Republican. One foul, immoral politician is just as bad as another one.
We're involved in sort of a low-key war against apathy, and something's got to be done before America scarfs up the world and shits on it.
The question is, whose views shall prevail today? The majority of people in this country are my age and younger. The people who run this country are people whose ideas were formed during the 20s and 30s. They believed, literally, against the advice of the CIA, that this was a communist-inspired and supported anti-war movement that was in league with black revolutionaries who would try to overthrow the government, and in league with hippies who were going to fornicate naked on the beach at the same time and fill Lake Michigan with LSD. the whole package was not believable.
We can change, yes, we can change the world. I've never seen anything as horrible in my whole life.
Too much law and order will always create disorder. And that's what they did.
The decision to ask the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association to sponsor, as it were, a march in Derry, in my memory, it was taken sort of not in any democratic way. It was taken by Eamon Malach and myself in conversation. We were aware that we might provoke a reaction, and we were prepared for that. It didn't deter us.
When we were discussing among ourselves, Eamon McCann and Finn Burness, the route of the procession, I was absolutely adamant that we should end the meeting in the Diamond. And the reason for that was this: the Unionist Party was never going to allow a non-Unionist demonstration to desecrate wholly Unionist territory within the walls.
We wanted to symbolise the fact that we were not a Catholic nationalist a movement, that we represented, or at least wanted to represent, the lower orders, the working class in the Protestant community as well. We wanted to make it clear that our demands would be in the interests of the Protestant working class. And part of that was to start the march in Duke Street in the Waterside.
We were creating sort of social mayhem in Derry, doing things that we should not have been doing, like squatting, etc., blocking roads, stopping traffic, all this sort of thing. Then, when the civil rights idea got into people's heads, for instance, when other people started to get involved and demanding rights, liberal people, middle class people, if you like, then the Northern Ireland state felt it was then something to worry about.
The policy about banning parades in what was being seen as potentially a dangerous situation was one on which the Cabinet as a whole were agreed. I mean, it'd be quite wrong to say that this was simply a Craig initiative taken in the face of the Cabinet view.
I found out that the march had been banned when a policeman arrived at my front door and delivered to me sort of an order banning the march. I must say, it didn't occur to me to obey the order at all.
When the leadership of NICRA realised that the Derry people were not accepting the ban, they broke ranks. One or two of them in Belfast came out and began to agree with the Derry people. So they broke ranks. And then it left us in a situation where we says, how many will turn up?
It would have been unusual for us from Belfast to be drafted into a place like Londonderry or the Northwest, but it became essential because of the burden that was being placed on local police, that they couldn't always be expected to handle situations like that on their own and needed reinforcements.
The morning of the 5th of October 68, I remember we had a loudspeaker van. You had to have loudspeaker vans in those days to publicise your events. And some of us toured the city centre. I remember driving with Charlie Morrison, who was a trade unionist and a member of the Derry Labour Party, and Ivan Cooper through the city centre, calling upon people to turn out in the afternoon and march with us. And we were stopped on the Strand Road by the RUC and we were arrested.
First of all, they tried to persuade us to call the march off. When that wasn't successful, I've never been able to understand this properly, because what they did was they released us 20 minutes before the march was due to start. And obviously we went straight from the police station. We walked to the Waterside, to the railway station where the march was to commence.
I
remember a delegation from Belfast coming to our house, and Jerry Fitt was one of them. I think it was about 3 or 4 people, and they were expected. And so my mother and I had sandwiches and tea ready for them, you know.
I was initially very disappointed with the turnout. I had actually assumed that we'd have a few thousand people waiting in the waterside. It wasn't a few thousand, it was a few hundred.
All you need for a march or a demonstration to be successful, a protest to be successful, is to have enough people to fill a television screen. That's all you need. So the fact that there's only 400 people there to begin with doesn't really matter, because there's enough people to fill up the TV screen.
I have come down here this afternoon in the company of my 3 Westminster colleagues. Mrs. Anne Kerr from Rochester, MP, Mr. Russell Kerr from Feltham, MP, and Mr. John Ryan from Uxbridge. I can say here that it was only by force of time that we only have 3. We could have 30, or in fact we could have had 300.
I'm here today to simply see what is happening with regard to the freedom of people to demonstrate. Having myself been maced in the eyes, that's why I'm wearing these glasses, and having been bashed about and pinched by the police of Chicago, I'm concerned about the people of Northern Ireland, and as I am about the people all over the world.
We organised a bus to go to Derry. There were 30 or 40 people on it, including a hitchhiker whom we picked up on the way, who was a bit surprised to find what he had arrived in the middle of.
As we were driving in, we could see these police tenders full of police and darkened out vehicles. And there was a feeling of, oh, that's not supposed to happen. What do they need all those police for?
Any person who wishes to parade or hold a meeting is quite at liberty to do so, provided he holds it other than in an area specified in the order made by the minister. We hold it, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I would certainly hope that in conducting this march in our city, that we will act in a responsible manner, demonstrating to the authorities that our intentions are to secure civil rights for the people of our cities and not to cause strife or bloodshed in our city. We are demanding homes, employment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
The march started and didn't go on the appointed route. Time we reached the top of Duke Street, the cops were already a number of rows deep. They're blocking off the front of the march. And then we noticed that the police who had been behind us had come up and were at the rear of the march. So we were trapped really, sort of with 2 lines of police.
I was in the front row with Jerry Fitt and Eddie McAteer, and there were people who were in the second and the third row were quite determined that the MPs would remain in the front row. Jerry was beside me. Jerry was felled, but I managed to get through. And when I got to the other side, I decided that wasn't a good place to be, so I came back through. And I got 2 blows on the shoulders, but luckily enough, not on the head.
Betty Sinclair, I remember her shouting, you must go home, go home. Now I thought, well, my God, we didn't bring all these people here to tell them just to walk away again, you know?
I remember when I was standing in the chair in Duke Street, preparing to speak and hesitating, there came a shout from the crowd. which was, what about the Mexican students, McCann? And then I realised what he was talking about, that there had been sort of the student demonstrations against the dictatorship in Mexico City just a few weeks earlier during the Mexico Olympics. And the point that he was making was immediately obvious to me. Well, you know, if the Mexican students, who had scores of people, possibly hundreds of students, were massacred by the Mexican police at that time, that if they could stand up to that sort of repression, why couldn't we? And that certainly sort of was prompted me to speak in the way that I did. The person who shouted, what about the Mexican students, McCann, was Mickey Devine, who some years later, obviously, was the last of the H-Block hunger strikers today.
I was a neighbour of a police sergeant who happened to be in the front row that day, and I recollect that one of the things that he said to me was, "What are you doing with this bunch of Fenians, Ivan?"
It's at this point that the Derry radicals, the Belfast radicals, and people up from Cork, they start to kind of try and get the provocation. So they start hurling placards at the police, they start shouting Sieg Heil and making loads of references to Nazis, and they keep goading them, they keep using missiles to try and get some sort of reaction out of them.
You could feel the hatred. That was my recollection of that day, that it never got started, but you could feel the hatred. And it was my first realisation that the police hated us.
This wasn't a crowd control operation. You know, if you really wanted to clear people away from Duke Street, you wouldn't box them in at both sides. This was a punishment operation. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew that.
Clearly, preparations had been made to deal very harshly with this march if they had brought up water cannon, which had never been used in the UK before, I think. So they seem to have made a very clear decision to stop this march in its tracks and physically batten it off the street, perhaps in the hope that this would mean there wouldn't be any more marches if that's what they thought they were very wrong.
I was euphoric. I was delighted. I mean, people think me heartless. Some of the journalists interviewed me at the time, and I was bubbling with enthusiasm. I said, I'm very sorry that so many people were hurt. Very sorry, but listen, this is the most important day of my life, and I believe for working class people, the most important day. I was euphoric.
For us as young socialists and presumed radicals, it was a baptism which we did not try to avoid. To be showered by the water cannon and to go home with your shirt drenched was it was something to acclaim amongst your own peer group.
I was a student radiographer in Altnagalvin at the time. It was my last month of training, and I thought I would be of better use up in the hospital. It counted 43 people who had to have skull x-rays. Yeah. One of the first patients I had in was Jerry Fitt himself, and he was about the third or fourth patient in, and I said to him, reminded him who I was, and he said to me, oh my God, he said, I didn't think when I was having tea and sandwiches at your house this morning that you would end up x-raying me.
I've got 3 stitches in my head at the moment. But I will say this, that 3 stitches will not deter me from carrying on the fight which I have undertaken on behalf of the ordinary people of this country.
They did come right up to the police lines Now, whether that constitutes a provocation or a deliberate attempt to create a situation of disorder is open to judgment, and I would let others judge whether that was their motive or not.
It was assumed, I suppose, that if members of the RUC were hitting people over the head with batons, that is exactly what the Northern Ireland government and O'Neill wanted them to do. I mean, in fact, it's a bit of a myth, you know, that the RUC was directed in everything it did by the Minister of Home Affairs and the Stormont government. They were rather more detached from that than many people would suppose they were.
This is absolutely perfect. I mean, they scripted this, and everyone played their role. You know, NICRA agreed to sponsor it. Bill Craig banned the march. Television crews turned up. Prominent figures from the Labour Party, MPs turned up. They got everything they wanted, and it just, you know, complete anarchy and mayhem ensued. They got exactly what they wanted. They unmasked the authoritarian face of Northern Ireland. They revealed what Terence O'Neill's Northern Ireland really was like.
The film that went around the world that showed the brutality of the police was a tremendous victory for the civil rights movement.
There was new violence today in Northern Ireland after weekend riots left more than 80 persons injured. The trouble stems from complaints by Roman Catholics of alleged religious discrimination by the area's Protestant-run government. British Prime Minister Wilson has asked for an investigation.
I literally remember seeing these marchers in Northern Ireland going towards Derry on the road, and men being hit with the water cannons and beaten. It was familiar enough. Everything looked like Birmingham, Alabama, or Chicago.
The fact that it on television certainly was hugely important because it bounced the news story out from Northern Ireland sort of into the mainstream British media and the mainstream Irish media into the South, and that in itself confirmed sort of that this was not just another incident in the civil rights movement or the general struggle in Derry, that this was something distinctly different.
The 5th of October March is the beginning of the civil rights movement. A mass movement's created, and it's also the beginning of the Troubles, because this is really almost the point of no return. This is when a new cycle of Northern Irish politics begins. It wrong-foots the Unionists, it inspires the Catholics, it begins a series of violent demonstrations, and some peaceful demonstrations, but there's a lot of violence which just escalates and eventually allows the Provisional IRA to emerge.
Looking back at all those events, the absolute incredible memory is that all of the things that you remember happened between the 5th of October and the end of the year. The pace at which things happened after the 5th of October was unbelievable.
The thing I recall most about the aftermath of the October the 5th March was the number of people who came up to and said, using the exact phrase, things will never be the same again. And they were right, you know, and we all sensed that this was a plot point in the narrative of Northern Ireland history. We had now taken a turn. We knew that.
Throughout the whole world, where you have a Roman Catholic majority, you have a lower standard of democracy.
The moment you kind of have violence breaking out in the country, it brings out the kind of worst elements, the stuff that's hidden away, the stuff that's kind of locked in the attic of all these societies. That comes through. So in America, it's racism. Racism comes much, much more to the surface, and we have the white backlash. In West Germany, it's the legacy of the Holocaust, and so the Holocaust is kind of brought to the surface, and there's, for the first time, a real serious discussion about the legacy of Nazism. In France, it's the traditional right-left divide that had been in place since the French Revolution. And in Northern Ireland, it's sectarianism, and that is what's brought out.
This violence, of course, is in the part of the Roman Catholic Church and always has been. When the Church of Rome accepts the Constitution of Northern Ireland, when the Roman Catholics are prepared to fly the flag of the country and to sing the national anthem, then we will get back to what would be normal conditions.
We hadn't expected to have a mass movement quite as quickly as we did. We didn't have the organisational structures actually to control or even politically to provide decisive influence on the mass movement which erupted.
The civil rights movement was just a tremendous opportunity missed by the British government, really. I mean, it was a very genuinely non-sectarian attempt to reform Northern Ireland.
The Ulster Police do a very good job in extremely difficult circumstances.
This movement has really grown and grown very fast. It's now unstoppable, and reform is the only thing that can, in fact, satisfy us.
There is no sphere of life which has not been affected by what happened in Duke Street and what happened, say, in America, France, South Africa, etc. That it was a pivotal year, and we were just part of that international struggle.
We don't seem to have any law and order anymore. It seems as if the police have given in to the forces of anarchy.
Saw you walking. If King and Kennedy had lived, if the permits had been granted for Chicago, what would have happened if the authorities, the colonial authorities in Northern Ireland, would have said, yes, let's have all the Catholics, even the Republicans and the Nationalists, equal rights? I have no idea what would have happened. I'd like to believe untold numbers of lives would have been saved.
Catching pebbles. What I'd say now about 1968, not just in Northern Ireland, but more generally, is that in that year, and certainly in Duke Street in Derry in 1968, we caught a glimpse of how things might be. And that stays with me. That stays with me to this day. And I think it stays with, thousands of other people, that the world could be very different, and that we could cleanse all oppression and ugliness from the face of the earth. We got a glimpse of that possibility.
We did not appreciate that we were changing the world. We did not see ourselves as transformative forces, but that's what we were. Because dogs biting us in Birmingham made people bleed all over the world. Children going to jail for freedom's sake in America inspired oppressed people around the world to defy established order. And so one can only appreciate upon reflection just when they're saying we shall overcome in Ireland, we shall overcome in Gdansk, Poland, we shall overcome in Shopsville, South Africa. We in fact use our bodies as living sacrifices to help humanize, democratize, and change the world.
And I know you know it too. Every time I see you, I just don't know what to do.
BBC Northern Ireland. Your weather covered. On TV, radio, online and mobile.
The BBC News now on BBC One Northern Ireland with Hugh Edwards and Michelle Napier.
Tonight at 10, stock markets are sent into free fall by the latest fears about the financial system. In London, share values crashed by £93 billion amid concerns about the response from European governments. It's the worst fall in the city for more than 20 years since the Black Monday crisis. It's the same story in France and Germany and in New York, as governments warn the system has to change.
Where there has been irresponsibility, we must now have instead transparency, integrity, responsibility, good housekeeping, cooperation across borders.
And the day brought new signs of a sharp slowdown in the British economy. Also tonight, a safer test for Down syndrome. American scientists reveal they've developed a prenatal